There's no one time. And what's interesting about trying to answer your question, the question was, if the prison population was relatively so low 45 years ago now, when did the crime that drove the spike start to really happen? I take that to the question. And what's interesting is it wasn't a spike in crime that drove the rise in incarceration. They're separate. And there are connections between Nixon announcing his war on crime and war on drugs and the beginning of that spike. There are periods when crime was going dramatically up, such as the 1960s, and the prison population went up with it. There is the enormous spike in serious violence that came with the crack epidemic. There's no question about that. But there were dips, there were rises in the crime rate. It had no impact on what was going on with prison. Prison just went up and up and up and up and up. And since the early 90s, when a long trend of basically increasing crime in the country reversed itself and crime's been coming down, from your perspective, down, the prison population has just continued to steadily increase. And it's been driven by laws like 3 strikes laws and mandatory minimums. It's been driven by differences in sentencing behavior, not statutory behavior, but judges are much more likely to sentence you for a violent crime or a drug crime into longer periods than they used to. It's been driven by the sort of general broadening of criminalization. Things like zero tolerance laws. We arrest and incarcerate for things that either didn't get arrest or didn't get incarceration in previous decades and generations. So there's no single driver of the incarceration boom. But what's really important to understand is that it simply isn't crime as such. It's not that for any given crime there was always a kind of quantum of incarceration, and as crime went up, incarceration went up. They're not linked like that. Incarceration has been its own independent dynamic within the country now for decades.
I have a question, follow-up question to that. It has to do with the privatization and the industry aspects of the system. Again, the community tends to see that as a motive for some of the things that you're saying is symptomatic and not intentional.
Yep. So the question was, what about the role of the private prison industry in driving this?
Because often we see rural communities, particularly in Pennsylvania and other places, you have Walmart and a prison, and that's the economy of that rural community.
Yeah, that's right. So the other reason I like getting invited to places like this is because if I don't keep getting invited to new places, I don't have any place to go, because I make people really mad. So the fact is that I'm going to say that that's part of the community narrative about why this is a deliberate conspiracy. And as a factual matter, I don't believe that that narrative is correct, and I don't believe that private prison is in fact the driver that so many people in the community think that it is. And part of that is that private prison is, as bad as it is, and I'm as offended by it by anybody, but it's only 10% or thereabouts of the national prison population. And that's not insignificant, but it's not enough to explain why all this is going on. There are a few places, and California chief amongst them, where it's not the private prison industry, but the public prison industry that is really driving things. Because the prison guard union in California, because of its extraordinary boom in incarceration, which is even greater than the national increase, they now have such political power that they can prevent criminal justice reform from going through the California legislature, and they do. There's no question about it. That's not going on in every state. And the rest of what's going on really has been the confluence of a bunch of social factors that when you take them all together and in the way that they interreact has driven what's going on. I wish that there were just one or two things behind it, because then you could slit their throat and you'd be done with it, but it really doesn't work like that.
You said earlier that the prison population has kind of tapered off in recent years, around 1.3 to about 2 million. Is there any indication that it could spike again at some point?
So the rate of growth has flattened, the absolute population has not, and this is really important. It's been, just as you said, it has been now steady for a few years at this incredibly elevated level, and there's no real sign that absent some outside intervention it's going to tail off again. I don't think it's going to spike again for two reasons. So one is that when you look at the factors that have been driving this, one of them has been this social conviction that all of us have grown up with, to the point that it's hard to believe that this wasn't the attitude of the country forever. But actually, in the period leading up to the mid-70s, the criminal justice consensus in the country was to draw prison down, and that prevention and diversion and efforts at reintegration were the thing to do. It's kind of hard to imagine now, but that actually was the social thrust. That obviously changed, and so one of the things that's been driving all these different factors is a basic social conviction and a political conviction that being tough on crime is the way to deal with our crime issue. When you've got persistent crime issues, as we have in many places, and you've got 2.3 million people in prison, it's pretty hard to make that argument anymore. It's very hard to find people now who will say even to themselves, we're not being tough enough and we need to do more. It just doesn't make sense anymore, even to people that it would have made sense to 15 years ago. And the other is people are really realizing what the bill is. People cannot continue to pay even for what they've gotten now. And the idea that legislatures, no matter what their principles in politics, they are not going to sign up to increase this by another 25% or 50%. They just can't. They can't do it. And in this weird way, the work that I'm part of, our biggest friend has been the recession, because people are looking at what they're paying for the stuff that they know doesn't work. And in these times, for the first time, they're saying out loud, we know this doesn't work, we want to invest in this other stuff. And we should be outraged about 1 in 3 black men in prison because it's outrageous, not because it's too expensive, right? But I'll take what I can get.
Mm-hmm. What role do you see restorative justice playing in these reforms?
I think this whole thing is basically restorative justice. So I think restorative justice, which says, and I'll butcher this because I've only got 30 seconds, but basically restorative justice says relationships between even victim and offender matter more than what the courts can do. People do the right thing not because they're under threat from the state, but because their community and their friends and their family say there's right and there's wrong. We do damage when we lay hands on too many people, all that sort of thing. And because the restorative justice movement has arisen in conscious opposition to mainstream criminal justice, they often restrict themselves without knowing it. This isn't deliberate, but they restrict themselves to a position where they say, we want to keep this young man from getting caught up in the system, therefore we will channel him into a restorative justice alternative. And what that means in practice is you can't do it for serious crime because nobody's going to take a risk on a gunslinger. There can't be that much of it because there aren't that many programs. It's mostly restricted to juveniles, and it gets smaller and smaller and smaller. But one way you can look at what I've been talking about when you come to these moments of community intervention, it's restorative justice. It's the engagement of the community in particular with the people who are driving things, The community is the victim here. The community is represented. There is this exchange between these two parties that is in a safe and secure place. It has tremendous normative impact. And you hope that waiting in the wings only when necessary is the power of the state. So this whole thing is infused with the core ideas of restorative justice.
Well, how do you get people to come to the meeting in the first place?
You make them. Part of the problem with restorative justice is that it doesn't believe in authority, and there has to be a place in all of this for authority. You can't look at the law, no matter how damaged it is, and say, we reject that. Every culture needs to have law, and as the original police theorist said, in every society there has to be a point where there's a role for the or else. Not everybody is going to comply, not everybody's going to behave. You've got to get that right. And when, for example, you have a bunch of gangs in a city, because they are such profligate sinners, every gang has somebody on probation and parole. Basically, they just do. So the first version of this was to identify the gangs, to figure out how you want to engage with them, which is this community and social service and legal warning piece. And you have the court authorities bring in the guys who are on probation and parole. They have to show up, you talk to them, you let them go, and you have effectively communicated with all the crews in the city. And I'm being a jerk about this because it actually turns out to be a lot simpler than that. And we're working in cities now where we're organizing ministers and giving them the names of the impact players in their community. And they are working through their own community networks to reach out to them and their families and say to them, we want to talk to you. And they come into the church and this conversation is had. It's just talking. And part of what, when you look at this, part of what's so insane about the way we do this is that even when we literally know who's at the core of this stuff, we don't talk to them. We operate on them, we threaten them, we send signals, we arrest their friends and think they're going to understand what that means. We don't talk to them. And the core of this is actually just talking to people. Yeah, please.
Okay, I know you said that you talk to them when they're on probation or when they're not in prison, but there are, of course, still people from these gangs in prison, and when they come out, they can't get a job, they're likely to go right back to what they were doing.
Yep.
So do you get to them and talk to them before they leave, or is the hope that the community will have shifted so they're no longer drawn into their own ways?
Both. You want to work on as many pieces of this as you can. So one early version was, just as you say, you look for people who are about to rotate back in, you talk to them before they're released. There's a captive audience for you. This is actually pretty easy to put together. There are versions that meet with them in the community as they hit the community. And in Washington State, we're about to launch the first of these that is actually focused on the culture of the institution. So the basic ideas here are going to be mapped onto prisons that are being riven by gang problems. And part of it is going to be people from the community coming in and talking. Prison gangs have real leaders, they really do. And community people are going to come in and, again, in these controlled ways, say to them, I'm raising my granddaughter because my grandson ran with you and you filled his head full of these ideas and he came back out and he got himself killed and we're left with the damage that you leave behind. We'll see whether it works. We'll see. Mr. Newhouse?
I may have my head in the sand, but I'm not aware of what has been going on in Lancaster. Could either you or Professor Glaser give us a thumbnail sketch of that?
You bet.
I'm going to give you the very condensed thumbnail sketch because you and I can talk later. and there's been some coverage in the paper. But in 2009, and then just about 2 weeks ago, the Lancaster Bureau of Police, working with community people, pastors, Luis Torres over there, and Pastor Sons over there, including, have gone into areas of Lancaster that have been plagued with some of the problems that Professor Kennedy described, and have called in drug offenders. Now, in this case, these were people from whom the police had bought drugs and could have been arrested, and called in these drug offenders to deliver them the message that if they stopped what they were doing, they wouldn't be arrested, and they would be given a chance to return to the community. But if they didn't stop, they would go to jail. And this has been done now. First, there's 2 incidents of that. And the goal is both to provide people with an opportunity to turn their lives around, but also to send a message to other people out in the community that the police are willing to play fair, they're willing to give people a break if they're willing to step up and take advantage of it. But if they're not, then there's always, as Lewis has said, prison ministry, where people can find a new way under little different circumstances. And so it's been a combination of law enforcement efforts and community service, as well as person-to-person discussion. And we can talk a little bit later on about some more of that, and I can give you some other information. Back there, and I'll give you back the mic. You'll have to talk loud.
Okay, I can. Does your program account for the fact that a lot of the families, the median age is getting a little younger as far as who the matriarch of the family is, and as far as, you know, the grandmother is crying, and the mothers are getting younger now, and they don't have that same responsibility towards, not all, but you know, you don't see the same responsibility towards your future or the generations, because a lot of them are taking their babies to their elderly grandmothers. How does your program account for the fact that these generations are getting a lot younger, and it's not necessarily the 18 and 19-year-old males now, it's the 15 to 17-year-old males who don't have the same concept of, oh, I can get caught. They still think it's not going to be me, and why should I respect my mother? She's only 30. You know, does it account for that?
It doesn't fix it. I don't know how to fix it. So I hung out for a while with some of the neocon Washington crowd that were interested in these issues. And they had big conferences at the American Enterprise Institute and places like that, where they would conclude that the only route out of this mess that we're in is to reconstitute the black family. And my dad's an engineer, and I have this instinct that says, okay, how? Right? And I don't know the answer to that. When they said this to me, I said, I have absolutely no idea how you can do that. What I do know that you can do is that you can amplify the power of legitimate adult authority in the neighborhood. And that you can do. And so I'm going to challenge you a little bit on some of at least how people are going to take what you said, right? So I don't want to presume that you disagree with what I'm about to say, but what people hear when you say what you said is the families are broken, the mothers don't care, the kids don't respect their mothers, all that sort of thing. And as much as that's true, it's not as true as people think it is, right? So there's some truth to it. But the mistake that outsiders make is looking at a kid on the corner who isn't doing what he ought to be, looking at a young mother and concluding from that that she doesn't care and she's got no power. And as bad as it often is, more often than not, that's a real caricature of what's going on. And you actually get to know that family, and as challenged as she may be, she's trying hard. And as much as he's not listening, he knows that she cares. He's just deciding not to pay attention to her. And it's not because he doesn't have any respect. it's because when you're a 17-year-old young man and everybody runs with their friends when they're 17, it's just that the stakes in these neighborhoods have gotten so high that what a generation or two ago or today in a healthy white neighborhood, you might get in trouble, you might get suspended, you might get in trouble with the cops. The cops are going to take you back to your family. You're going to get killed or you're going to get a record in these places. So you can't reason backward from bad outcomes to what we often assume about individuals and families and neighborhoods. They're healthier than we think they are, even if, as you say, they're really trouble. But having said that, I don't know anybody who knows how to fix those families. What you can do, and some of this again gets back to the sort of street math of what's going on. As troubled as those families may be, most of those young men do not become drug dealers, do not become gangbangers, do not pick up a gun, will never shoot anybody. And those who are really at super high risk for that, we know who they are, we can isolate them, we can deal with them in these special ways. And part of dealing with them is creating around them a community construct that works like a family should work. It's not a substitute for a family, but it has a lot of impact. So,
or better yet, because I mean, a lot of your stories, like to set the stage in the beginning of your speech or whatever, were about how younger kids are saying that they might end up in prison. So would you say that programs need to be in place for these children so that they don't end up on the street or they don't end up wherever?
I'd love to think that programs could do that. I don't see programs that work. So the choice for a long time has been between this higher and higher and higher voltage criminal justice response, which a lot of us don't like very much. If we don't like it very much, what we've said is we need a program. And if you look at the programs, especially aimed at the most serious stuff in the most serious neighborhoods, they just don't do anything. I would love for it to be otherwise. And it's an empirical question, right? It could change tomorrow. Somebody could come up with that program that works, but the ones we've got don't work. And one of the things that was the most shocking to me when I really started to spend time in these neighborhoods, I was prepared for the anger against the police. I got that. That didn't really surprise me. I was shocked by the anger at the program people, because if you're in these places, what you see decade after decade after decade is people taking money on the back of your problems to do things for you that they don't do. And the vicious anger at the sort of social service industry in these places is pretty amazing. The place that I've come to on this, and a lot of the people I work with, is if the reality is that everybody's getting killed and everybody's going to prison, no program's going to undo that. We have to stop people from getting killed and stop them from going to prison. And that's going to leave a lot of damage behind it. But maybe at that point, there's stuff that we can do, not only for the kids, but for schools and economic development and housing. We're never going to get that work done when what we're up against is the violence and the mass incarceration. We've got to change that.
I have more of a location. I have a little bit more of a location-specific question. I'm actually from Rochester, New York, and I knew that the violence there was like equal with New York City level, and it's a small city. Yeah, I had heard at one point it was worse. I wasn't sure if it was now, and I thought it had gotten better. I was wondering how your program there was actually doing, because my brother still lives up there, and it made me a little nervous that it was mentioned again.
It worked beautifully. The authorities in the city didn't take it seriously, and as soon as they could let it fall apart, they did. And everything came back. This has happened in a lot of places. You know, until this stuff becomes taken as seriously as programmatic approaches or normal criminal justice approaches, as long as it's somebody's pet side project, it won't last. It's too much work. And it runs too cross-grained other ways that we do things. On the other hand, what you see going on here is happening with the genuine commitment of the top people in the responsible agencies. As I understand it, it's got real community participation. The community would like to see it expand. And when you've got that kind of environment, it can become normal and you can keep it going. Doing this work in Rochester is like trying to push spaghetti through a keyhole. It's horrible. They're talking now because there's been a changing of the guard. They're talking about bringing it back.
Could you give me just a high-level overview of how you apply this concept to domestic violence? I imagine that the role of the community is probably a little smaller, considering that so much of it happens behind closed doors.
That's my thought too, and it's been really very interesting and very surprising. So this one's hard to explain. This takes a while, but let me see if I can do the thumbnail version. So what they're doing in this city in North Carolina is, and this took years to put together, this took an enormous amount of prep work, but if you're a guy and your partner calls 911 on DV on you, and it's the first time the police have contact with you, then you get a letter from the authorities saying domestic violence is this city's highest priority, which it is right now. We will not tolerate this. There is no revolving door. If you keep on doing this, we're going to pay even more special attention to you. Your victim gets a similar communication about her safety and her options. If you get called on the second time, whether it's her or anybody else, you get a visit from a domestic violence investigator from the police department. He sits down with you, he tells you exactly what's going to happen if you keep on going, which I'll talk about in a minute. Your victim gets a visit from a domestic violence specialist that, among other things, says to her, we don't want you to be taking responsibility for this. Domestic violence is not your problem, it's violence. We want to fix this. So if you want to call the next time he hits you, that's great. Who would know if he's abusing you? And it turns out that if you ask women this question, they will say, my sister, my boss, my mom, my neighbor, my daughter, my daughter's friends. We go to them and say, we're worried about this, with her permission. If she's threatened or hurt, we want you to call this number, and it's working, which means the guy feels like everybody's watching, which is exactly what we want. The third time, he gets called in. And this is the moment where there's community participation. So he gets all kinds of legal attention, there's a certain amount of social service attention, but the community piece is, and this has been really amazing, they have these call-ins in a room not that much smaller than this one. They will fill the room with community people who are devoted to doing something about domestic violence. And if you can imagine this, the first time we did it, there were about a dozen guys sitting over here. They were the worst of the worst in this city of about 120,000 at the time. There weren't that many of them. This is what's interesting, that when you get to the very sharp end of the DV pyramid, just like everything else we've been talking about, there aren't that many of the most serious guys at any moment. And When I walked into the room, the doors were in fact over here. I walked in, and sitting here were a dozen bikers in full colors and leather and all this stuff. And I turned right back around and walked out to the chief of police and said, you got a room full of bikers in there. And he said, yeah, I know, they're our friends. They're working with us on this. And when the early reporting on this had hit the papers, this entire motorcycle club had reached out to the police department and said, we hate domestic violence. We want to do something. What can we do? And they said, you can testify. So when the call-in started, all the community people got up, including a dozen of these bikers, one by one, and stood at the microphone and looked at these guys. So, they're almost a hostage audience over here. And you've got these 300-pound guys in colors and leathers and spurs and piercings and tattoos, and they looked at them and said, I'm the road manager for whatever the cycle club is named. I hate domestic violence. And I think we won right then and there. Forget about the cops. Nobody wants to mess with these guys. And it's been going on for about 9 months. It's too early to know for sure yet, but it looks like as people hit this system, they're basically not graduating to the next level. It's having the kind of arresting impact that we want, but mostly they're not getting arrested. So we'll see. I'm not claiming success on this one yet, but it's looking promising.
David, to bring that to a local level, like our campus, or you're at John Jay College, how could you apply some of that to, we're actually putting in, peer health educators are here that did a walk a mile in our shoes to show the advocacy and prevention. But how can you do that on a local level? We're putting in for a OVW grant with McCaskey High School in the city, and looking at how you maybe change some of that paradigm. How could you apply some of those philosophies, not necessarily to the ingrained North Carolina group where there's repeated, but the dating violence that occurs in high school and college campuses?
I think this is a really good question, and the way this work works is that before you can answer questions like that, you have to sit down and really, in a very granular way, unpack what's going on. So part of the problem with traditional responses to this stuff, whether it's criminal justice or social intervention, is that you basically, without knowing all that much about what you're dealing with, you apply the same responses. You arrest, you investigate, you patrol, you mentor, you provide services. And this stuff is meticulously crafted to the actual facts and dynamic that you're dealing with. And what we've learned about this is that when you really get down to the very fine details and look at what's going on, you can figure out a way to make that application. But the sort of general response to how would this fit an entirely new issue is you really got to figure it out. I would be optimistic that you could, but I don't know the answer standing here today.
One more question, and that might be you in the back, and then we'll thank Professor Kennedy, and if you want to meet with him outside, you'll be able to. One more.
I know you said, like, aside from prison, a lot of the work that you want to do is be able to really get in there with the community. I guess it's just hard for me to grasp how you can get a gang that's kind of like a corporation. If you really think about it, there's a leader, they're bringing in money. It's pretty much their life that they deal with. To kind of sit down and tell them to stop, I guess, their life. I don't know, I guess it's just hard for me to grasp. And also with the church aspect, I totally agree. I think we should like take more people and have them there for advice. But what do you do if they're involved in the underground economy, receiving money from gangs?
So if there were one thing that I could think of to improve the quality of discourse about crime and criminal justice in the country, it would be to pass a law that nobody could watch crime shows anymore. If gangs were as they were portrayed in movies and media and stuff, the stuff wouldn't work. Well, actually, it turns out that in a way it's easier when they're organized because there's somebody in charge to talk to, but forget about that for a minute. The fact is gangs are not the way people think they are. They are not corporations, they're not organized, they have no leadership. This is true of most gangs. They are fantastically chaotic. And in fact, mostly what gang members do is hang out. They don't do anything. And then if they deal, they grab two friends and they go deal. There's no business plan, there's no investment, there's no distribution of income. It is as random as you can possibly imagine. There's some exceptions to that, but they're really actually very few and far between. And part of the point is, and part of the reason this stuff does actually work as well as it does, is they're not getting rich. Gang members, especially at the lower level, they make less money than they would make in a minimum wage job. This idea that everybody who's working on the corner has a Range Rover, it's a complete fantasy. They get robbed, it rains, there's nobody to sell drugs to, they get arrested, their connection gets shot. It is a tremendously inefficient way to try to make money, which is part of why we shouldn't sentence people to this by making it impossible for them to move over into a legitimate work. Because if it was easier for them, more of them would do it. It is not a good or prosperous way to live. And I have lots of problems with churches in these communities. Lots and lots and lots of them. But a big one is not that they're getting paid off, because they're not. The gang members don't have enough spare money to worry about the ministers. They really don't.
Well, thank you very much.